Unit 9, Period 9, we're discussing the presidency of George W. Bush. And in particular, today we're going to talk about the terrorist attacks that occurred here in the United States on September 11th, 2001. The terrorist attacks occurred in three places. The first place that the terrorists attacked was the World Trade Center in New York City. World Trade Center are the two tall buildings that you see in the picture here of the skyline of New York City. The terrorists, after taking off from a airport in the United States, took control of the airplanes and then took their commercial airliners and flew them into each of the buildings that make up the World Trade Center. Eventually, because of the fire and the jet fuel and things like that, both of the buildings eventually collapsed to the ground. Here's a picture showing one of the airplanes flying into the side of the building. And this is what it looked like after it exploded. Also, another plane had terrorists take control of it, and this plane flew into Washington, D.C. to the Pentagon, shown here, where the military's top officials plan and for military actions and things like that. These terrorists flew this commercial airliner into the Pentagon and exploded it into the side of the Pentagon. And the third plane that attempted to attack was taken over in mid-flight and flown back towards, we're not sure if it was flying back to Washington, D.C. or is flying back to New York City, but it made it back to Pennsylvania. And what many believe happened was the men and women on the plane attempted to wrest back control of the plane from the terrorists. And either the terrorists chose to crash the plane into the ground, or in the scuffle, the plane lost control and blew up. Here's a picture of the farm field, and you can see the area where the airplane smashed into the ground. The group that claimed responsibility for this was called Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda is a terrorist network that exists all over the world. But specifically, they train in the countries of Iraq and Afghanistan. And so George W. Bush, President of the United States, after the attack, stands on the rubble, the remains of the World Trade Center, with a bullhorn, and declares that he is going to bring about a war on terror against these people, specifically their leader, Osama bin Laden, shown here. And so the first step by George W. Bush was to add a new department in his cabinet called the Department of Homeland Defense. And that was a department that was supposed to attempt to secure our country better. Officials were hired to work at airports all across the United States to ensure security of our airlines. And if you ever go to an airport, you're going to see these warnings letting people flying on the airplanes know what kind of threat level there is in the United States from terrorism. The second step is George W. Bush is going to decide to send our military back into Iraq. Intelligence tells us that Saddam Hussein was still continuing to build weapons of mass destruction, such as what biological warfare weapons that I show here in this picture. And also here, you can see American soldiers taking out some mortars and some rockets and things that are hollow and can carry weapons of mass destruction. The third reason why the United States intervened in Iraq was what Saddam Hussein was doing to a minority group in his country called the Kurds. They lived in an area here on the border with Turkey, and Iran, and they were being militarily harassed by Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was attempting to wipe them out on earth. So many of them were in refugee camps like this in the mountains between Turkey, Iran, and Iraq. And Saddam Hussein sent his helicopters there, his armored helicopters there filled with poisonous gases, and killed many of the Iraqis living in this valley, in valleys like that. So the purpose of George W. Bush going back into Iraq in a war known as the War for Iraqi Freedom is to capture and possibly kill this man, Saddam Hussein. And that's exactly what the United States was able to do. In a short war, much like the Desert Storm War, the United States was able to go in, capture Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was tried by Iraqi courts and hung by the neck. Another country that was found responsible for the attacks on the United States on 9/11 was Afghanistan. Afghanistan's a very poor country, very mountainous, but their leadership was allowing terrorists to train in their country. So the next goal of the United States comes to remove terrorist training camps from Afghanistan and to attempt to overthrow the power of the Taliban in that country. The Taliban, possibly shown here in the photograph, were a terrorist organization that had been fighting against invaders in Afghanistan for hundreds and thousands of years. This concludes Unit 9, Period 9, the terrorist attacks on September 11th and the aftermath.